Good morning. I know y'all know church very well. I know this because all y'all came in here and sat in the back first. That being said, Deaconess is a ministry of the United Church of Christ. It might feel churchy for a second here, but in the spirit of what Constance was inviting you to, I've been in spaces with Dr. Pastor before, and he likes engagement too. So this doesn't have to be, this is not a lecture in that way, but really designed to be a conversation. And I'm glad, my name is Starsky Wilson, I'm glad to welcome you all here. It is my job, and I'm going to do that job, and I lay it out for accountability's sake to introduce our speaker, and so I'm going to do that. On the way to that, I need to honor and appreciate a few other people who have helped to make this time together possible. The entire Community Conversation series is supported by a gift from the estate of the late Ruth and Carl Rashi. Ruth Rashi was the wife of Carl Rashi, who was the president emeritus of Deaconess Hospital, one of our predecessor organizations. And Ruth was the historian of the Deaconess tradition, writing the first story of the Deaconess heritage, including the Deaconess sisters, all the way up and through its centennial in 1989. And their estate created the seed from which we're able to provide the context of this space and conversation. It's also, of course, supported by Deaconess Foundation today and partners at the Amplify Fund. Some of you have come to know of the work that the Amplify Fund is going to be doing in our community. In June of this year, when the Neighborhood Funders Group convened in St. Louis, the announcement was made that they would be investing in several communities across our nation. In Puerto Rico, which, of course, with these anniversaries that we experienced this week, we're reminded of is critically important. Here in Missouri, in North Carolina, and in California. In those various places, they will be investing and engaging communities in the project of democratizing development. Following and investing in grassroots-led, people of color-led community development to help to rebuild communities based largely on the kinds of principles we'll be talking about today, about equity, about building power, and making sure that folks who live in neighborhoods have the opportunity for self-determination. We find that critically important for the neighborhood that we have chosen and we're glad to be a part of here in St. Louis, and we're pleased to partner with the Amplify Fund and know that some of the local advisors for the Amplify Fund are here. I won't ask you to stand, but just wave. If you're one of the local advisors for that project, just wave. Okay, thank you very much, Laura Greenwich. We also note and appreciate those vendors who are here with us, who are working with us on this project, Speak Up Productions, who helps to chronicle the work that we're doing. I don't think you've actually had an event if Wiley Price didn't take a shot of it, so we're glad that Wiley Price is here. And then just outside the doors, our neighbors from Progressive Emporium here in the area are selling books, and principally among them, State of Resistance by Dr. Manuel Pastor. So we encourage you, if you have interest, to see the folks at Progressive Emporium to carry this knowledge forward. Finally, I want to give my thanks to the staff, of course, of Deaconess Foundation who have made this remarkable day possible. Chief among them, as it relates to this project, Constance Rush, who you have seen before, Liz Riley, and David Nerett Flores, who manages here the center. I'm a black preacher. I always got like 3 closes. On your seat when you got here, was this report called Follow the Leader, a philanthropic strategy for effectiveness. This is not the report you were promised when you got here. You'll get that a little later. The Missouri Power Audit. This is a report we released yesterday with a table of local funders encouraging investing and talking about the critical value if philanthropy is to be effective in investing in black-led organizations to advance equity because of some of the topics that we'll talk about here. So we encourage you, if you have questions about that, to see us with that as well. Finally, because they've given me a sign, I know that my time to do what I've called to do is upon me. To introduce a remarkable voice and a critical leader in the conversations related to regional and racial equity and power building across our country. We've been pleased to be introduced to his voice at equity summits that were national and in convenings in California, and to be reading his work. Dr. Pastor serves as professor of sociology and American studies and ethnicity and director of the University of Southern California's Program for Environmental and Regional Equity. He's also director of the USC Center for the Study of Immigrant Integration. In those roles, he wears many hats. He holds an economics PhD from the University of Massachusetts Amherst, is the inaugural holder of the chair in civil society and social change at USC. In his research, he has a whole lot of books. You can buy this one today, and there's one by the title of this conversation, Equity, Growth, and Community, What the Nation Can Learn from America's Metro Areas, that you can get for free at the University of California Press. So you can buy this one today and get that one, download that one for free to advance your knowledge. What is most critical is that his voice has helped to inform not just philanthropic strategy, but organizing strategy, economic development strategy for regions across this nation. And we are pleased that he has brought that voice to St. Louis and to the region. At Deaconess, we are critically engaged in his work as the changing states framework that the power audit you'll be introduced to later has been integrated into our logic, model, and theory of change for how to build community capacity in this region to advance public policy that is friendly for our children. So I invite you to welcome with me at this time, and after we'll have some Q&A and then get into the power audit, all the way from California, Dr. Manuel Pastor.
Thank you, and I'm glad that Starsky had to say all that boring stuff, thanks and stuff like that, because following him, you're right, was not something I would like to do. But it reminded me that I once, many years ago, when the first Iraq War was about to take off, there was a sort of teach-in about it, and I was asked to speak, and I agreed I was going to speak on the economic consequences of the war. And as I was about to get up to speak, they said, just a second, someone arrived and they've got to go before you. And it turned out it was Ed Asner, the very famous actor. And he didn't speak, he just got up there and he acted out a scene, and people were feeling very emotional. And I was scared of what I was going to have to do when I got up. And they said, well, wait a minute, somebody just slipped in ahead of you and we've got to let her speak. And it turned out it was Maxine Waters, the fiery congresswoman from South Los Angeles who had just been elected. This was going to be her first important vote. And then she got done, and before she got down, she said, and I have a special guest, Jesse Jackson. Jesse gave a pretty good speech, and then I got brought up to the stage, and as I walked up, there were two students of mine in a crowd of 2,000 applauding. One of the loneliest moments of my life. So I'm very glad to not follow a long talk by the Reverend. So I'm going to talk a little bit about this this work, equity, growth, and community in a changing and divided America. I'm going to try to drive it a little bit to what's going on here in Missouri and St. Louis. I'm going to start first at a national level. Talk a little bit about demographic change, talk a little bit about some rethinking that's going on in economics about why dealing with racial equity is actually central to generating economic prosperity, particularly as we move forward. And then I'll have a sort of stirring and emotional close that'll have you in tears. So, but I always like to let audiences know before I speak that while I'm speaking, my voice might tire out or break a little bit, and you might think that it's because I'm emotional being with such great organizers in St. Louis. It's partly that, but it's also that I have a speech condition that's called spasmodic dysphonia, spasms around the voice box. Diane Rehm on NPR had it, Bobby Kennedy Jr., now me. And so that'll explain if my voice tires out. I always often like to let audiences know, too, that, and this is true, that it gets treated once a month with Botox, which is how we treat everything in Los Angeles, so it really sort of works for us. So one of the key things to understand in terms of a sort of national politics and the national anxieties that are out there have to do with the changing demography of the United States. And you can see from this graph here that it's predicted by the year 2043, 2044, the U.S. becomes a majority people of color country. And certainly those kinds of undertones of that have been what helped to drive some of the electoral results that we just saw in 2016. Now, what's interesting about this, there's many things that are interesting about this, is that if you were paying attention during the 2016 election, and I hope you were paying attention but not assuming that anything got said was true, you would have thought that what's driving this demographic change in the United States is what? Immigration, particularly undocumented immigration, illegal immigration. And that's like so wrong, it's crazy. Immigration into the country has actually stabilized. This is the share of foreign born. That's that little orange bar down there. That was to 12.5% in 2006, and then it skyrocketed to 13.5% in 2016. Immigration flows into the country have basically stabilized. Now there are more immigrants coming from Asia than coming from Latin America. And most significantly, immigration from our largest sending country, Mexico, is now negative. There are more Mexicans returning to Mexico than coming to the United States. And that's something that will continue into the future because of the demographics in Mexico. It used to be over the course of her life, a woman in Mexico would have, about 30, 40 years ago, would have 5 kids. Now that fertility rate is 2.3. In the United States, it's 1.7. As those two come together, less of a sort of push factor. So more Mexicans returning to the United States, to Mexico, than coming to the United States, which means that if we build a wall, we're just penning Mexicans in, which is pretty sure was not the intention, but would be the result. So what is really driving that in the United States is the shift in children, many of them being born to immigrants, of course. So you can see that between 2000 and 2014, there was actually a decline in white youth, youth under the age of 18, of about 6 million. Now, this does not mean that 6 million young white people died. We would have noticed that. What it does mean is that there's more people moving into 19 and 20 than moving into 1 and 2, right? So a decline in white youth, sort of stable for black or African American youth. The big growth, Latino youth, 5.6 million, and the API youth. And then a lot of folks who are identified as multiracial, and that's partly explains the slight decline in black youth, more black youth identifying as multiracial. But that's one thing that's really interesting about this is when you look at that sort of 5.6 million young Latino youth, almost all of them U.S. born. There are 800,000 Latinos every year turning 18 who are U.S. citizens who can vote, and they are pissed. So, so big demographics change. One interesting thing to think about with this demographic change is the following. If you look at the demographic change in the U.S. between 2000 and 2050, you'll see that it's projected to go from 69% non-Hispanic white to about 47% non-Hispanic white, majority people of color. That is basically the demographic change that California went through between 1980 and 2000. I say in a lot of ways the United States is now having its Prop 187 moment. Prop 187 was the proposition that stripped all sorts of social services, including educational services, from undocumented Californians in 1994. It was quite quickly followed by bans on affirmative action, elimination of bilingual education, criminalization of black and brown youth, et cetera. That's a lot of the tone of the country right now. But what people forget is that in the early 1990s, California also suffered half of the country's net job losses in that recession, and that Rush Limbaugh began his talk radio career in Sacramento, California in the late 1980s. Perfect stew of demographic anxiety, economic uncertainty, profiteering from political polarization. We did it first, and we're now on the other side, which is why, by the way, this is such a damn good book that you should buy, which is about all of that change in California. It's excellent. It's being sold outside. The bookseller's right there. For those of you who are not readers, it's about to be made into a major motion picture in which I was going to be portrayed by Antonio Banderas. Turns out it's George Lopez, but I'm still pretty excited about the fact that it's a movie. So that's the demographic change. We kind of happen in California. But what's misleading about that is that people then think, when they look at the projections for the nation, that the demographic change is just going to continue to occur in California. That by the year 2050, California will become 150% Latino, sort of super Chicanos marching the earth, declaring La Reconquista Aztlán, we're back. But what's going on is our demographic change, as you can see, is actually slowing down. And what's really going to be going on is demographic change in the rest of the country now. So when you look at the country in 1980, this is a map of the counties in the United States, easy to interpret. The browner the county, the browner the county. So you can see the kind of what people often think, the black belt of the South heading up to D.C., the borderlands of Texas with Mexico, and the sort of Hispanic and Native American areas of New Mexico, Arizona, Native American areas of the Dakotas. As you move from 1980 to 2010, a lot of demographic change, but a lot of it in the western United States, and a lot of it, if you loop back, in California. That's what we just saw. But as you move forward to 2040, or maybe it's 2050, you can see that diversity is coming to a theater near you. So there's going to be big changes. Actually, it's not so much in Missouri, and we'll get to that in a second, but really remarkable changes around the country. So for example, it's not something you would expect, by the year 2035, the Salt Lake metropolitan area will be majority people of color. I know. When you think of Salt Lake, you don't think white, you think shiny white, right? I mean, just kind of Book of Mormon white, right? But and that's true, but they've had in the past, in 1970, they were sort of 95, 98% non-Hispanic white. But what's gone on is that, in particular, because of the Mormon tradition of missionary work, they've had a welcoming attitude toward the immigrants. And so they've had a big influx of both immigrants from Latin America and immigrants from Africa, big demographic change. So what does it look like if we drill down to this area? Much slower demographic change. This is St. Louis projected forward. We will not be majority people of color even by 2050. Fairly stable. Sorry, the colors disappeared, but the gray is non-Hispanic white. The sort of orange is African American. The blue is Latino, and then the green is Asian American. So what you can see is that you have a fairly stable African American population, slightly growing Latino population. One thing that's interesting about the St. Louis metropolitan area, you're much less immigrant than the rest of the country. So if you look at the way in which the share of immigrants, share of foreign born in the population has increased for the rest of the country, much slower in the St. Louis and also in the Missouri more generally. So less demographic change here, but still important demographic change looked at in a different way. So this is the state of Missouri, and it's asking the question in the 1980s, who contributed, what ethnic groups contributed to growth? And then in the period 2000 to 2012, 16, what's the share of the sort of population growth attributable to each ethnic group? So when you look at the 1980s in Missouri, 70% of the population growth was coming from white Missourians. And then when you move to the more recent period, it's only about 35%. But more striking is the St. Louis metropolitan area. In the 1980s, about 62% of your metropolitan growth metro growth, not just city, was coming from whites. None of your metropolitan growth is coming from the white population currently. It's all coming from African American, Latino, Asian, and then the other group. So that's the big demographic picture. I want to do two other things about the demography, and then I'll talk about economics a bit. So the other thing that you're quite typical of is an interesting phenomena, which is the suburbanization of the people of color population, right? And you're not alone in that. Actually, a couple of years ago, after the shooting of Michael Brown in Ferguson, I was asked to go to a meeting in New York, and we were talking about policing and a bunch of other kinds of issues. And I started my comments by saying, I want you to imagine a small suburb just outside of a big city. It's in an area that's experienced tremendous deindustrialization, so the white working class has departed, and the small city has gone from being kind of overwhelmingly white to overwhelmingly people of color. And then the police force took to preying on its own people to collect fines in order to sort of have the coffers of the city have money. Of course, I'm talking about Maywood, California, in which the preying was done on undocumented immigrants through by towing their cars at stops for people not having licenses, and then using the fines on that to finance the city. So Ferguson is singular in its in the drama, in the importance to people who are from here, and certainly to the residents of Ferguson and the Brown family, and singular in terms of some of the issues. But it's not singular in terms of being one of these suburbs that has this overwhelming change in its demography, and this kind of misfit between old institutions and a sort of new population. And you can see when you look at St. Louis City, that's about 48% African American. The whole metro area is about 19% African American. And if you look at a sort of dot map, and here the gray dots are groups of whites, and the green dots are African American. And you can see if you look in 1990, there's a little bit of spillover into the suburbs, right? But you're really seeing most of the green dots in St. Louis and then over into East St. Louis, right? But when you move to the most current period, right, huge influx into the set of suburbs of which Ferguson is one, just northwest of St. Louis. Now, what's interesting is that this is not, again, a phenomena limited to this area. The suburbs of the United States are getting diverse faster than the cities. And in many big areas, for example, Seattle, that city's actually getting whiter because of gentrification. San Francisco as well, the only county in California that's projected to get more white over the next 30 years. It's actually interesting too. San Francisco is, I think, the only city in the United States in which there are more dogs than there are children. Wow. There's like little yuppies with their dogs instead of kids, right? So, so our cities are changing, partly through redevelopment. Suburbs are seeing this influx of people of color, poverty is growing in suburbs, et cetera. And why that's important is because suburbs often don't have the civic infrastructure, they don't have the social services infrastructure, and they often lack the organizing infrastructure, which is how people get their issues put on the table in civic life, is through organizing. So that's a lot of the demographic thing. I'm just going to do one more thing on demography. So first, has some of that been interesting to you? Yeah. Okay. So none of it is as interesting as this. To me, this is the most interesting set of charts around demography, and they have to do with the age structures of the population. So this tells you the median age, half older, half younger, by ethnic group. So for non-Hispanic whites, the median age is 43 in the United States. The median age for Asian Pacific Islanders, the labels disappeared on this for some reason as they moved to your system, is 36. The median age for African Americans, 34. The median, that's the same for Native Americans. The median age for Latinos, 28. So 43, 28, 15 years. That's a generation gap. And it explains two things. It explains our demographic change. Because when you're 28, you're in prime family formation age. When you're 43, you think you're in prime family formation age, right? You may well be. Godspeed. But it also helps to explain our politics because we have an older generation looking at a younger generation, not seeing itself, and as a result, not wanting to make the investments in the children. And one of the reasons to lift up race in this conversation is because if we don't understand the way in which race divides these generations, we're not going to be able to get at kindling up the spirit of common ground to make the investments we need in that next generation, which I'll get to in just a minute. Now, this does have real consequences. You might think that we're pointing this out, but it's not that important. But for example, the state in the United States that's got the biggest racial generation gap, the whitest old and the brownest young, is Arizona, with its fractious politics around immigration and ethnic studies in the schools. But more significantly, Arizona had until this recent teacher strike, had the largest cuts in K through 12 per student spending over the last 8 years since the recession. Older generation not seeing itself at a younger generation. And another way to do that is to take a look at the racial generation gap, the percent of folks above the age of 65 who are white compared to the percent of folks below the age of 18 or kids of color. And we do that in this graph looking at California and the United States. Interesting thing, the racial generation gap peaked in California during Prop 187. Do you know when it's peaking in the United States? 2016. And if you think about that sort of generational and race chasm that elected Donald Trump, this is part of the phenomenon. So all of that is occurring, all of these demographic changes are occurring against a backdrop of economic shifts as well. So this is the share of income going to the top 1%. That's the blue line from 1917 to 2015. What you can see if you follow the blue line is that there's sort of a peak in the 1928, right before the Great Depression. The next peak is in 2007, right before the Great Recession. Coincidence? I don't think so. I'll get to it in a minute. But you can see that we're now more unequal than we have been at almost any time in our history. Now, it's partly the 1% has run away from the rest. And that's the result of lots of things, financialization, CEO pay. In the 1960s, the average CEO, chief executive officer, made about 20 to 30 times what the average worker in his firm made. Now the average CEO makes 350 times what the average worker in his or her firm makes. I'm not sure they've gotten 15 times more productive, having watched them run the economy into the ground, but the pay gap has increased at the top. But the other thing that's gone on, and it's pretty dramatic, particularly in Missouri, St. Louis has underperformed in terms of job creation, but I'm going to go back here. The gray bars are the United States, the orange bars are Missouri. We'll look at St. Louis in a second. And this is in the chart that you guys have used too. But what you can see is that generally what's gone on is, so this is for year-round full-time workers, people who have a job. And it's also looking at what happened for people at the 90th percentile of the wage distribution. So not the 1%, but people who are pretty well off. The 80th percentile, the median, the 20th percentile, and the 10th percentile. So you're going to notice a couple things here. First, people at the top their incomes generally went up. People in the middle went down, and people at the bottom fell dramatically, right? And what this is about is not the 1%. I mean, the way I like to think about this is I'm a professor. I make a lot more money than professors ever made because the ability to speak a few languages, use technology, et cetera, it's highly rewarded. My dad was a janitor. If he was alive, he would make a lot less money than janitors ever made. So beneath the 1% is the shifting wage distribution around skills, and it's made a big difference, yes.
Can I ask a question about the slides a couple back? Yeah. I don't know if you're going to talk about this at all, but it's pretty striking that the blue line starts crossing in the early 80s.
Yes.
Since, so is there, I guess my thought goes right away to tax policy.
Yes. I'll say a word about it later, but I'll say a word about it now because you asked. Yeah, it ticks up in 1980, ticks up with the election of Ronald Reagan and the shift in tax policy. And the reason why is that before, with higher marginal taxes on the wealthy, people wouldn't say, they wouldn't fight for a super high salary. They go, I'm not going to make that much more anyway, let's put it back into the company. But when you take the marginal tax rates and lower them so much, then CEOs have the incentive to cash out as much as they can instead of putting it into the company and trying to collect stocks. So we changed the financial incentives in a way that drove income to the top 1%. And this is, by the way, pre-tax. So once you factor in the tax, it's even worse. It's even worse. It's just that the changing the taxes changes the incentives about do you put the money in the company and get the stock later, or do you put the money into the salary that you'll pull? So lots of inequality in terms of race, in terms of these are your unemployment rates for whites, blacks, Latinos, and Asian Pacific Islanders. A lot of, particularly in St. Louis, another way in which people lack access is they lack access to transit to get to the jobs that might be there. And the problems that we're facing are potentially going to get worse, and then I'm going to move into the optimistic last 10 minutes part of this thing. Because this is a graph that I think is very important. It's the kids of color kids who are concentrated in high poverty schools by race. High poverty school is defined as a school in which more than 75% of the kids are in free and reduced lunch. In Missouri, only 8% of white kids are in high poverty schools, but 54% of black kids are in high poverty schools, and about 30% of Latino kids. So that is going to bake inequality in moving forward. So let me just jump over this. So that all is a challenge, but there's a couple of bits of good news. The first bit of good news is the following. We are starting to wake up to the problems that that's going to create for our economic future. And that's not just something that's happening through people who have traditionally perhaps been liberal or concerned with questions of inclusion in the past. There's been a shift within the economics profession as well. How many of you took economics in college? Okay, that's great. Okay, but I'm going to test your knowledge. One of the first things you learned, I'm sure, was about the minimum wage. And what you learned about the minimum wage was that if you put a minimum wage in, what will happen to employment? What did we teach you? It goes down. Completely wrong. There's almost no evidence for that. And there's a big book that was put out called Myth and Measurement. So good indoctrination, not true. The other thing, and this is actually a rethinking going on in the profession, has to do with the relationship between inequality and growth. We used to think that inequality, you might not like it morally, but inequality might be good for growth because it creates more savings in hands of people who can invest, and also it creates the incentives for people to go out and work. At an extreme, that's true. If you were in the Soviet Union in which you squashed all differences, you wouldn't have incentives and you wouldn't have savings. But it's also possible to get at the other end of the extreme in which you've got so much inequality that you've squashed down consumer demand, you've created social conflicts, you're not getting the tax revenues you need to be able to fund public education, and you're not having workers who are motivated at work. And so there's a new bit of research taking a look at the relationship between equity and growth and finding some remarkable things. So, for example, there was a study done by that well-known left-leaning organization, the Federal Reserve, that looked at metropolitan regions much the size of Cleveland. They were based in Cleveland, and they asked what drives economic growth over time. And what they found out was there were things you would think drive economic growth that do. Having big anchor institutions like universities, having a diversified industrial sector. But what they found out, a little bit to their surprise, is that if you have a lot of inequality, that slows growth. If you have a lot of racial segregation, that slows growth. And that was then replicated by a study by another well-known Marxist organization, the International Monetary Fund, responsible for bringing communism all over the world. And they were trying to take a look at which countries were able to sustain growth over time. And they found out that the biggest single predictor of a country not being able to sustain growth was inequality. Because inequality would lead to underinvestment in public education, would lead to social conflict, and that social conflict actually threatened private property rights and the ability to invest over time. So it's not that the relationship is just one direction, but that we've gotten on the wrong side of the equity growth trade-off. And that's really what we try to do in this other book, which is downloadable for free. It's kind of a teaser, so you buy the actual book, in which we took the International Monetary Fund model, replicated it looking at the metropolitan areas in the United States, 200 metropolitan areas between 1980 and 2010, and we asked the question, what predicts employment growth over time? And again, some of the things you would expect, education is really important. By the way, the education level that's the most important for predicting growth is having a lot of people with an AA degree. Because it turns out that community colleges fill in the middle of the labor market with the kind of skilled workers that leads to manufacturing and kind of steady employment over time. I always like to tell people that because we often forget about the community colleges and how important they are. They're also the place where black and brown youth are. That's where people are going to get started, right? And sometimes end, and you want them to end with something. But we found out that inequality was a big drag on economic growth. We found out that racial segregation was a big drag on economic growth, and we found out another thing, metropolitan fragmentation. That's when you've got a lot of governments per people. You guys are good at that here, by the way. So when you've got so many governments, people aren't coordinating, that actually turns out to have a negative impact because you can't get together on an economic development strategy. So we then did something that's somewhat unusual for people or economists. We decided we should talk to real human beings. So instead of just running numbers, we went out and talked and found out what it is that actually sort of helps areas come together and decide on what their strategies are to bring together innovation and inclusion, equity and growth. And I'm going to get the hook in about 5 minutes. So I'm going to try to talk a little bit about this and come to 3 central messages I want to sort of leave you with. What we found out was the following thing, and it's going to require something that's very difficult for Americans to do, so please bear with me. To hold 2 ideas in your head at the same time. It's very difficult for us to do that in the United States, right? So first idea is that regions do better when they create tables for people to collaborate, and that those tables to collaborate are often based on data and knowledge so that you at least define the problem together. Very important. Second thing is that conflict is actually an important part of collaboration. And I really want you to hang on to this because When we talk about collaboration, people often think about like hanging out with their friends and agreeing on stuff. That's not collaboration, that's hanging out with your friends and agreeing on stuff, right? Collaboration is principled conflict. It's getting together with people that you have some conflicts with, but you have some principles you agree on, and you have principles about how you will conflict. How you will conflict with integrity, with respect, and with the desire to get back together the next time. So let me say a little bit about both those things and conclude. So we know that we need new tables because our current institutions are broken. This is a graph that was done a couple years ago in which people were asking the question, what's more popular, Congress or something else, right? So first they ask, do you like Congress better or lice? And lice won by 67%. So then they asked, Congress or a colonoscopy? Congress was less popular than a colonoscopy. And I believe that the margin for the colonoscopy would have been higher if there were more people who actually had one. So the only thing that Congress was actually as popular was Nickelback, which is a Canadian rock band, which is a bad band. So in terms of people kind of getting together, we think that having data is an important part of that. And if you look at a lot of the kind of sort of collaboration and visioning exercises that regions do, they do try to agree on the database and then have a dialogue around that. However, one of the things I would really ask you to do is to ask the question, what data are you looking at? And are you actually looking at data that lifts up the disparities and differences and makes race and equity a central part of the conversation? Because if you're having a data dialogue about employment growth or income levels or just where industries are, but you're not asking the question, what's happening for the reentry population? You're not asking the question, what's happening for our immigrant population? You're not asking the question, what's happening for particular populations, you're not going to get to a good result. So recommend our National Equity Atlas that we've developed with PolicyLink, which disaggregates data for all this kind of stuff. The other thing I'll say is what I lifted up before is that conflict is an important part of collaboration. If you are trying to collaborate to try to deal with some issues of inequity, those issues are going to get onto the table often through protest. So if San Antonio, Texas is a place that is now celebrated very much for its collaboration. In 2012, the voters in San Antonio passed a sales tax on themselves to fund universal pre-K. With rolling it out first for disadvantaged kids. Remarkable, right? Perhaps most remarkable, it was supported by the San Antonio Chamber of Commerce because they realized it was about the workforce that they were going to see in 20 years. And interestingly, 40 years ago, community organizations were at war with the city and the chamber. The chamber was trying to market San Antonio as a low-wage city, which the communities didn't want. There were at-large elections, so African Americans and Latinos had a hard time getting onto the city council. They engaged in huge conflicts with the business community, but out of those conflicts grew respect and relationships that then led to the remarkable collaborations we see today. So I want to end with this. Actually, I'm going to end with this because I'm going to do this and then end, please. I'm an honorary black preacher for the day. I'm on my third conclusion. So, brothers and sisters, so this is one of my favorite graphs, partly because it's animated, but the other reason is that there's a concept which is called a demographic pyramid. And the demographic pyramid is the idea that there's a lot of kids, less people who are middle-aged, and then as we get into the older ages, there's less of us. And as you can see, this was true in the United States in the year 19 50. It was a pyramid. But as we move from 1950 to 2060, it's becoming a demographic cylinder. Less children being born, less immigrants filling in the middle, more of us lasting longer to a riper age. And that means the following thing. How many of you have children? How many of you want your children to do as well as you or better? How many of you would like your children to do worse just to kind of teach them something? So there's always one. You better hope that your children and everybody else's children do about 60% better than you. Because the dependency ratio, the ratio of older adults who are retired to those who are of working age, is going to rise by about 60% over the next 30 years. There is not a single person to waste in this economy. And the racial equity argument has always been an argument about fairness and inclusion. It is now a central economic imperative. We cannot have kids be washing out of the school system. We cannot have we cannot afford to not have reentry programs that work for people leaving the incarceration system. We cannot afford to not bring undocumented immigrants in from the shadows and fully into the labor markets. We cannot afford to leave our young behind. And that means that we must take racial and economic equity and center it into our economic development programs. It needs to be baked in, not sprinkled on. It needs to be a guiding principle for what we do. Second, we need to develop equity indicator projects that can help to determine what the strategies are going to be. It's a little bit of what we heard later with the power audit. We need them to be able to gauge progress and assure accountability, something I know that Starsky's talked about quite a bit. But the final thing I want to leave you with is the following thing, and I think it'll be a good glide path into what will be presented later. There's a very famous quote attributed to Martin Luther King, and he actually borrowed it from someone else, which is that the moral arc of the universe is long, but what? Bend towards justice. Someone's got to bend it. It does not bend on its own. God ain't going to rescue us. He might.
She left it up to us.
But to leave you with this quote, one of my favorite songs that's in this book is from the jazz poet and really the precursor to hip-hop, Gil Scott-Heron, who sang the song Ain't No Such Thing as a Superman, which says, you alone have the wisdom to make the world what it want to be, what it need to be, what it will be, someday you'll see. Once you understand that there ain't no such thing as a Superman. Once you understand that it ain't Obama that was going to save us, and that it ain't Trump that's going to take us down, we who will change this world and rescue this world are in this room. There's no such thing as a Superman. There's only us and the mission that we have to make this world a better place.